projects. Here to our left side is the Reed, for example. This is a new build from about 2023. As you might expect, inside, brand new appliances, private balcony space, lower patio area, private parking garage, clubhouse, workout center, swimming pool inside. If you want to know more, scan the QR code. That's why it's there. You know, they put it there for a reason. If you are looking to move in, lowest I was able to find there is going to be about $2,300 to $2,400. So it's month-to-month starting price for a studio apartment here. And then if you're buying that same studio one-bedroom range, you're looking at around $400,000 or so. Now next to it, down this way, you can see another curved concrete design. Looks kind of similar to a couple of buildings we saw towards the middle of town. Well, that was Marina City, and this is the sequel from the 1980s. We call this River City, and it's not as good. I'm joking, but it's not as tall, that's for sure. So it's like a scaled-back version. Now keep in mind, the 1980s, this area, the South Loop neighborhood, not nearly as popular as what you see today. This has gone through a lot of heavy work within the past 10 years. So this is kind of hanging out by itself. Now today this has been renovated. Up above, these have all been turned into rental properties. Starting price there for a studio around $1,900 or so. And then, I mean, still, even down this way, you can see yet another residential building actively being constructed. This one kind of shot up nice and quickly. It's going to have a very similar design layout to the Reed. You're looking at the parking garage down below, and then the actual residence up above. So I would say this is a little less than half the height of what they're expecting here. They still have a lot of work to do. Down this way to the right, you can also see that older building kind of hanging out by itself. That one's known as the Union Station Powerhouse. So that's an example of an old coal power plant that was in support of the railroads that were passing throughout this area. So, you know, industrial rails back in the day. That's all now been switched over to Amtrak and Metra, so they don't really have a use for this anymore. It was originally here from 1933, but then it hasn't been used for quite some time, decommissioned officially in 2011. Now granted, that was a lot of great architecture, and we're going to see even more architecture as we travel down this way. Underneath Roosevelt, you're going to see a lot of newer builds. We'll talk about that briefly a little bit later on. But you know, on these tours, I also like to sprinkle in just a little bit of Chicago history, because I think it provides a lot of context into how we got here, which is I think is important to point out. Now, on these tours, I like to tell you two stories. The first has to do with the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, and the second has to do with the World's Fair of 1893. Let's start with that fire. We're pretty close to where the fire started. It's about 3 blocks back this way to our left side, or right side. But over there at the time, there was a small home and a small barn in the backyard. And living inside the home were 2 Irish Catholic immigrants by the name Catherine and Patrick O'Leary. But that is where the facts end and the rumors and urban legends begin, because the story that you might have heard, you know, of how the fire started, it says that Catherine was in her barn one night milking her cow Daisy, and she sets down this kerosene lantern, and then Daisy kicks that over, and that sparks the barn on fire, and that's the fire that spreads through Chicago, burns the entire city to the ground, and ultimately was all Catherine and her cow's fault. Well, that is a completely made-up story. It's not true. It was actually the story that was originally published in the Chicago Tribune newspaper, and then years later, even the author of the article said, nope, I made up that story, I needed someone to blame, and good stories sell a lot of papers. So that's why I did it. Okay, so then the question becomes, how did the fire start? Well, the truth is, we don't really know. Still today, it's a mystery. Now, we do know a couple key things. Number one, we know around where the fire started was somewhere near that barn. We also know that it broke out on the evening of October 8, 1871, around 9 o'clock p.m. We know that it spread quickly due to the intense winds and dry weather. But the wind spread the fire to the south branch just behind us. And when it reaches that area, the river was incredibly polluted and industrial. So there's this thick layer of grease and oil coating the top, and that seems to catch fire, and it jumps across and it spreads into the city itself. And at the time, we were not prepared for a fire. Quite the opposite, in fact, because, you know, back then, Chicago was going through rapid expansion and growth, but at the cost of very cheaply made buildings. And the primary building material was wood, right? So wooden buildings, wooden streets and sidewalks, that's all catching fire, and it's all spreading further east and further north, about the lake and further north. And it went on for about a day and a half non-stop. Now finally it did stop about a day and a half later when we got some relief from the rain, but by that point it was already far too late, because by that point between 17 to 18,000 buildings had burned down. It was about 3.3 square miles worth of land affected. 1 out of every 3 people was left homeless, and over 300 people lost their lives. So it was a huge tragedy unlike anything Chicago had ever seen before. But I don't really bring up that fire story because of the tragedy itself. I bring it up because of what the fire led to, and it led to Chicago making a lot of major changes. So after the fire, we were able to start to learn from our mistakes and to space out the buildings and the streets more appropriately, update the building codes, bring in new architects from around the world, and have them experiment with these different architectural styles. So you start to see the rise of these new buildings made of stone and brick and clay tiles, oftentimes used for their fireproofing properties. Eventually, that leads to things like the birth of the skyscraper right here in Chicago in 1885 with the Home Insurance Building, designed by William LeBaron Jenney, towering 10 stories tall. But back then, that was quite the achievement. It was the introduction of the steel frame, which eventually leads to all these magnificent skyscrapers behind us. So that's why I like to bring up that fire story, because of what it led to moving forward. But then now, if we move way forward through time to the year 1893, well, that is when Chicago hosted its very first World's Fair. Now, keep in mind, back then, no one really took Chicago that seriously. We had this reputation as this simple industrial town, but we wanted to shift the perspective and be taken more seriously. So by hosting the World's Fair, we could kind of blow expectations out of the water. And we did. The World's Fair took place in Jackson Park on the south side of Chicago, pressed right up against Lake Michigan. And what was placed there was this beautiful World's Fair campus. Heavy Greek and Roman influence for the buildings. A lot of them were actually temporarily made with this mixture of plaster, hemp, and concrete. But the buildings themselves were meant to mimic Greek and Roman marble, these giant Greek and Roman palaces of sorts. So then as people came to this World's Fair, they were pretty impressed by what they saw, and they'd even more impressed by all these things they were being introduced to. At this World's Fair, it might be the first time you're checking out things like diet soda, the hamburger, the original brownie recipe, which you can still try for yourself at the Palmer House Hotel. They sell these prepackaged versions of the original brownie recipe, and it's just okay. But that was the very first brownie that people ever tried, so we made a lot of improvements to our recipe since then. But then, other things that were being introduced, things like Cracker Jacks, Juicy Fruit Chewing Gum, and actually, given the top prize and being declared the best beer in the world,